to analyze those effects, to consider alternatives, and to mitigate those adverse impacts when feasible. Notice the when feasible. Projects, and by the way, I have to say that this body of law in California was created not only by the legislature, but by some very important state Supreme Court decisions that interpreted this in the early days. And I mention that because several of the current concerns, or some of the current questions about CEQA are based not only on the law as it was written and has been amended from time to time by the legislature, but on some of these early court decisions. For example, what's a project that's subject to CEQA? Is it only private projects or not? The Supreme Court held in a very important early decision that CEQA applies to all projects for which a discretionary permit is issued by a public agency that's likely to have a significant effect on the environment. That's a long sentence, so I'm going to break that up for you. Almost all land use decisions in California are made by local governments. So for purposes of local land use planning, the local government would be the lead agency. The lead agency is the entity that does the environmental review and the analysis and proposes the mitigation and monitors the mitigation to make sure it happens and basically oversees the implementation of the project. There are many instances in which a state agency is the lead agency. For example, if we were to give the Department of Toxic Substance Control authority, which we have done, to clean up toxic waste sites, the permits that it issues to accomplish that would be a discretionary act, clearly with a significant effect on the environment, and the state, in this case, would be the lead agency. Now, the other purpose of CEQA is to make sure that there is consultation between all of the knowledgeable agencies at both the state and the local level, and the federal level for that matter, to make sure that projects have the best information possible before permits are granted, or mitigation is required, or changes in a project are required, or any of the other possibilities. So there is that a major consultation role, and under state law, state agencies are often called responsible agencies or trustee agencies, which are designations to indicate that they have to be involved in the development of these projects and that their input has to be accepted by the lead agency before the projects are approved. So the courts also had to figure out when and to what degree of specificity or to what length the environmental analysis would have to would occur. And the court, well, first of all, the first big decision was that that CEQA applies to all projects that require discretionary action. I want to back up a minute and make sure you understand that that does not include ministerial decisions. In other words, getting a fishing license or getting a boating permit or even a building permit is not the kind of action that would go through CEQA. It's only discretionary permits. So how do you tell what's a significant effect on the environment? The court in another decision said, you look at that under a kind of a standard of reasonableness. If the plaintiff or the person who's opposing a project can make a fair argument that this is a project that will have a significant effect on the environment and that those effects are not being mitigated by the project, then the project applicant or the lead agency has to do the environmental analysis under CEQA. The environmental analysis under CEQA is also subdivided into chunks. The chunks range from a negative declaration, which is basically a determination by the lead agency based on substantial evidence that this project has no significant effects on the environment and can go. It's exempt from that point on from CEQA. There are other times when a project has significant effects on the environment and the applicant recognizes it, and the applicant and the lead agency and the other agencies have a negotiation. The mitigation is agreed to. The applicant signs on the dotted line and says, this is what we're going to do. And that project is then out the door, approved. The most, in about 4% of the projects that are applied for in California across the state, at local levels and at the state level, the environmental impacts are significant. There's a debate about what kind of mitigation is appropriate and how to require it, and who to pay for it, how to pay for it. And often those are the projects for which an environmental impact report, an EIR, is required. Those are what the folks in the business community really don't like. They're expensive, they are contentious, they are overwritten because some are just inclined to put everything in an EIR even though it's not really relevant, just to avoid the threat of future litigation. But it's a small piece of the overall CEQA world, are those projects that are in the EIR category. So, the other most important element of CEQA is that this approach, as I hope you're learning here, is really not a one-size-fits-all set of requirements. It's a flexible analysis designed to give a project applicant many different ways to get a project approved that complies with the overall objective of CEQA, which is the projects that have a significant effect on the environment mitigate those effects. That's the major purpose for the review process that CEQA requires. And the third major element of CEQA that is incredibly important is the role of public input and public participation. In whatever the outcome is of a project that is subject to CEQA, in every one of those pathways, whether it's a negative deck, a mitigated neg deck, an EIR, a public hearing, a new document that comes out on a project, there's the opportunity for public input, public participation, and the lead agency, and this law is very specific about timelines and when things have to happen, but those public comments must be responded to by the lead agency, and CEQA is a self-executing statute, which means that the public, assuming that you have participated in the administrative process and have raised issues that are included in the final decision, and if you're unhappy, you have the right to file a lawsuit against that project for violation of various provisions of CEQA. That's another provision that some in the business community don't like. So, you know, CEQA is the backbone of how California analyzes its, over the years, it has been amended a lot, and sometimes it's because the economy is bad and there's this conflict, there's this perceived conflict about economic growth and environmental protection. I mean, there are any number of arguments used to make suggestions for amending CEQA. From time to time, the environmental community in Sacramento and other business and labor and local government and state agency folks have put together fairly significant amendments to CEQA. Other times, it's just a power play by one, usually by developers or business groups, to amend CEQA in a way that is objected to by the environmental community. But we're now in a stage where a lot of the amendments to CEQA that have been made are viewed as inadequate by the business community, and I suspect that we're going to see some significant CEQA legislation proposed next year. And one of the themes that I think you're going to hear is something like this. If a project complies with for example, if it's a smokestack industry that complies with the Clean Air Act because it has scrubbers or whatever, then that part of this proposed new project doesn't need to go through CEQA. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. Well, the argument is that because CEQA requires an analysis of cumulative impacts and effects in the environmental effects in an affected community, and that just meeting a standard is not good enough, that you need to actually do a thorough environmental analysis of all of the impacts of a proposed project. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a taste for what I think is going to be in store in Sacramento. I just want to say, in closing, one thing. It's a complicated statute. And fixing it or changing it is going to be a very difficult endeavor. I think that, from my perspective, the issue is, are the proposed changes going to advance environmental protection in California? And two, are they fair? And that's where I will leave it. I mean, environmental issues in California are a huge challenge to our democracy. But our democracy is the best system we know of to try to resolve them. And CEQA is the bedrock on which these decisions are made.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be back here in this neighborhood. I was last here a few months ago when two of our idealistic urban planning students from Cal Poly Pomona were invited here by some members of the Santa Monica Airport Commission to do a study of some of the possible non-aviation uses of the Santa Monica Airport. After the students took on that assignment, I got a phone call from Santa Monica City Hall and learned that the city manager was not very grateful to have these students here, nor was the planning director, who happens to be a Cal Poly Pomona urban planning graduate. But the students did their work anyway. That was the last time I was here. It's also a privilege to follow Bill Craven, who, as you could tell, has very deep knowledge of CEQA, but also, as you heard in the introduction, was the key staff member on Senate Bill 375, the historic California law which links land use, transportation, and climate change. So it's great to have him here on this panel. And it's also a pleasure to precede Gail Goldberg. I was a member of the LA City Planning Commission for about 6.5 years. Most of that time was time spent under Gail's leadership as the planning director of the city of LA. When she first came here from San Diego, she was well known for saying that what was really needed was real planning. And I think that Gail learned a lot of lessons about what happens when real planning meets real politics. When Director Kuehl invited me to be on this panel, I warned her that I'm not a CEQA expert, and that the most I could do was to serve the role of being an uninformed debunker. And so she said, I want you on the panel anyway. So I'm here just to give you some thoughts about my own reactions to CEQA, how it fits into the planning process, and my general sense of what's happening out there. As a member of the City Planning Commission in LA, I used to routinely receive very voluminous environmental impact reports. Sometimes on major projects, very, very thick reports. And I have to be honest with you and tell you I did not read every single word in those reports. In fact, I even would wonder, why are we getting these reports, and why did the process require these reports be done, since as a commissioner, it seemed to me most of what is in these volumes being sent to me really have nothing to do with the criteria that I'm going to base my decision on. But I understood it was required by the law, and I think in listening to what Bill Craven said, even though we can be skeptics about CEQA, we can also appreciate the fact the original reason why the legislature, why CEQA became a law, is because local governments were not doing a very good job of measuring the environmental impacts of projects. Bad projects were being approved, and it was believed that CEQA would be a way to give local government a tool to make better decisions, and hopefully out of that, better projects would be approved. So if you accept that as the basic original intent, that seems to make sense. But today, many years later, I have to say I'm a bit of a skeptic. Not that I'm willing to throw out CEQA, but I also think that we have many problems, especially in the local government planning process, which are not solved by CEQA. CEQA is neither the cause nor the cure of what makes the local planning process in California sick. I think there are a lot of other things going on, including the effect of budgetary cuts resulting in major erosion in the number of local government employees hired as planners. There is always, I think, a shifting of political support in various cities for doing what Gail Goldberg used to call real planning. The disappearance of the redevelopment agencies, I think, takes away a major tool from local government. CEQA, I think, does accomplish at least part of what the original intent was. That is to force local government to face head-on what are the predictable environmental consequences of a project, and to require applicants to be thoughtful, or at least appear to be thoughtful, as to what can be done to mitigate the negative effects of projects. But these days, in the year 2012, I really think that there are many other things deeply wrong with the planning process, some of which have to do with money, some of which have to do with lack of political support, which I think, even despite these problems, sometimes the right decisions get made. In Los Angeles and some other cities, there are some very exciting things happening in terms of good plans being developed, You can see in terms of the shift of the way people move around in cities like LA, the rediscovery of the bicycle, the development of planning of new development around transit stations. That's very exciting. And I'm hoping that if there is a debate about the future of CEQA in the state of California, that it will not just be about the California Environmental Quality Act, but rather that hopefully be part of a larger discussion about what works with the planning process in California and what doesn't work. And ultimately, what is it going to take, whether it's new laws or new interpretations of existing law, to make the planning process make more sense and ultimately to produce better communities. That's what the planning process should be all about. And I'm worried that in some of the gunfights that are going to take place over the future of CEQA, we may lose sight of what is the purpose of the planning process underneath it all.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here this evening. I continue to care deeply about the future of our communities in Southern California and everywhere else. I am a planner, and I chose planning midlife. I say that to let you know that I knew exactly what I was getting into. I didn't think it was party planning. I understood what I was doing, and I did that because I care very much about the quality of place and the impact that place has on people. I also care deeply about public participation. I believe that decisions around land use, around quality of life, no one knows neighborhoods like the people who live in them. And so I believe in that greatly. I worked most of my career in San Diego, where I saw, I think, CEQA at its best. I saw greenfield development in the 80s and early 90s that protected canyons and took care of sensitive species or endangered species and sensitive lands. I saw a city join with their region in creating a really comprehensive, connected open space system throughout the entire region. And so I think I saw sort of the best of CEQA. I could tell you that at that point in my planning career, I would have said, I love CEQA. After I came to LA and watched CEQA try to accommodate development in very urban settings, I have to say I like CEQA, but I don't love it anymore. And partly because of some of the things that Mike already has mentioned, because I think that it's not the best tool to really give you good outcomes in urban settings. It was a heck of a lot better in greenfield development when, you know, everybody's motives were pretty clear. The dialogue was pretty respectful. And I think we all had the same intent in mind. But I have to say that one of the things that I think made for that better sort of public environment around CEQA was the fact that in San Diego there was strong planning. And so we were basing decisions not just on a project analysis that CEQA did, but we were basing our decisions on good community plans that the community had been fully involved in. So that's my experience. I have been asked tonight to share with you some of the concerns that the development and the business community have with CEQA. And I need to start by telling you, I don't hate developers. I don't think that all developers are bad guys. When my children were little, their favorite toy was Bob the Builder. Only in our house, we called him Bob the Responsible Builder. And I think that there are responsible builders, and so I do not discount everything that developers say. As a planner, I have always believed that it is the mission of planning to create wonderful communities. You don't do that by just creating a plan. You have to create a plan that a developer can pick up and follow and build in order for our mission to be accomplished. So I am not one of those people who is going to stand up here and totally badmouth the development community. Are they perfect? They are not. Are there bad actors? Yes, they are. But I would tell you that my experience in LA with CEQA, there's enough bad actors to go around. And it's not just the development community, because CEQA gets used as sort of a blunt instrument to stop development, to slow down development, to keep your competitor from getting a, his development through. I love labor, but labor unions use CEQA as a way of forcing labor agreements, project agreements. I mean, there are a lot of things going on with CEQA that are not pretty. I have seen community groups hold developers hostage for cash payments in order not to oppose projects. I mean, I've seen it all in LA, and believe me, there's enough bad actors to go around. So I think that we don't want to totally demonize any single element in that process. I think that developers in LA would say that despite the fact that there's only 2% that go through the CEQA process, if you have ever turned on TV and watched the City Council or the Planning Commission, either the City-wide Planning Commission or one of the 7 community planning commissions, you will see that there's plenty of projects there that they're making decisions on, and all of them have some sort of CEQA documentation. So developers would say, first of all, that there's too many, that there's no distinction between a good project that people want and a bad project that nobody wants, that they're treated all the same, and that the fear of litigation forces a lot of projects to go forward with a large CEQA process or a full EIR process when they may have, in a less contentious time, have gone forward with a mitigated neg deck. But they want to sort of bulletproof. And in this bulletproofing for litigation, they throw, as Bill said, everything but the kitchen sink into these CEQA documents, because another thing that developers complain about is that someone can bring a lawsuit and challenge an EIR by making what they call a reasonable argument, meaning, and a reasonable argument doesn't necessarily have to be a substantial argument. They can use anecdotal evidence. The EIR says there's not traffic impact. I was out there last week. There were 500 cars. I just saw traffic. Those kinds of anecdotal things. So I think developers are genuinely concerned that they're going to be challenged. And I think some of the data that I have read about EIRs that are challenged, that about half of them end up with no changes whatsoever, meaning there was no mistake that anybody could find in the EIR, despite the fact that they are, inches and inches thick. There was no mistakes that they could find, and in the other half, there are 1 or 2 technical errors, and developers would say there's no distinction between a harmless error, a small error that wouldn't have made any difference in either the mitigation or the project, or a substantial error that would have made a difference. If the court finds any error, they can invalidate the approval, and so developers don't think that that's exactly fair. I think that this threat of that it's not just the litigation that is problematic with the EIRs. It's the threat of litigation. So a lot of projects make concessions, and developers make concessions with folks early in the planning process or early in the process, because they feel threatened that there might be somebody who would oppose on a certain topic. So they will go out of their way and I'll give you some for instances, because my issue is what's the outcome? in the end, do we get a project that is better for us, a better project that meets our community objectives? And in the city of LA, for instance, we have decided that our growth strategy is to accommodate our growth around our transit stations and along transit corridors, because that is how we can accommodate growth without producing a lot more cars in our community that are going to do the greenhouse gas thing. So this is something we want, and that's where we want growth to happen. But because all of those areas have a lot of neighbors, it's not greenfield development where they're not neighbors to protest, they're neighbors that live around every one of those projects. And all of those neighbors are concerned that the added density is going to deteriorate the quality of their neighborhood. So projects that should have the density that is proposed in community plans, that we want to support our infrastructure investment, a lot of those projects get the density cut down immediately in order to make the community happy enough not to protest or to challenge the EIR. This is especially true of affordable housing projects. I mean, we desperately need affordable housing, but communities don't necessarily want affordable housing. I have seen great affordable housing projects get changed to market rate in order to accommodate the neighborhood that it's in. And while I understand that, I think there has to be some balance between the immediate community needs and the needs of the larger community. I mean, those are things, and I would now go back to what Mike said, because these are all things for me that are better dealt with not on a project-by-project basis, but they're better dealt with when we're doing comprehensive plans and all of the community members are at the table, and we have an opportunity to look at the entire planning area and do trade-offs. Perhaps, for instance, we want to concentrate development in this area, and we understand that we're going to have significant traffic impacts, and we're willing to live with that. Where we can, by making that choice, preserve our open spaces, preserve the areas that we've already learned that suburban development is not so good for sustainability or for service production. So these are trade-offs that need to be made in the context of looking at the whole community. And when you start making those decisions project by project, I am absolutely convinced that you do not always get the outcomes that you want. So I do not believe that CEQA is perfect. I believe that it is very important that we look at CEQA and try to fix some of these things. There are some developers out there who would say they want it thrown out, but I would tell you, I think there are very few of them. There are some developers who would say we need to take CEQA back to its original intent of protecting the natural environment, and we need to make certain that the quality of life things like traffic and service provision is put into a planning process, because that's the better place for that to happen. And I have to say I sort of fall in that category.
Traffic doesn't relate to.
Wait, we're gonna talk later.
So one of the things that I would suggest, if I could do one thing to CEQA as a start, if I could do one thing. Back in the 80s, in the mid-80s, one of the problems that we were having with our CEQA discussions with communities was around the provision of schools. You know, did we have adequate schools to accommodate the growth? And that was the fight we were having. And the legislature in, I think, 1986 enacted the School Facilities Financing Act that required local communities to actually create a plan to provide schools for the growth that was projected and to charge a fee to every new development that came in to pay their fair share, and we stopped fighting about schools. And that was done. I'm suggesting we should try the same thing with traffic. Instead of going through the CEQA project by project analysis, I think we should take traffic and make it a requirement that local jurisdictions do mobility plans that establish the priorities and the projects that need to be done to accommodate the growth that's projected in those communities, establish a fee that charges every single solitary developer who is adding 1 net square foot of development in that community, and we would be collecting money that we could use to actually perform the priorities of that community. And they don't all have to be the same. There might be suburban communities where the issue is literally traffic and level of service, and they want to spend money to make actual street changes and those kinds of improvements. There may be other communities that have decided that, look, there's nothing we can really do about the traffic, but we could spend money to make it a better pedestrian environment. We could have bike lanes. We could invest more in transit. I mean, it's an idea to get that discussion on a higher level and to actually get money to make the changes that we need to make. Because right now, if a project comes in under CEQA and it has traffic impacts that cannot be mitigated, and the local jurisdiction makes overriding considerations and approves the project, that happens all the time, that developer doesn't have to pay anything. And from my view, we have a lot of mobility improvements that need to be made. And we need to figure out a way to actually get those priorities down and collect enough money to actually do it. And so those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. My big goal is to promote better planning and to not rely on CEQA to do what I think CEQA was never intended to do. I mean, I think it does a good job of looking at the impacts of a project. It does not do a good job in looking at the comprehensive community and making decisions that are consistent with the goals and priorities of those communities.
Here we've had 3, not necessarily very different approaches. Remember, policy is not just about one law. And in our discussion, I know that you will bring out many of the things that you have been working on, that you believe, that you want to know. One of the points of view is CEQA was supposed to do something. Are we using it to do something that it wasn't meant to do? Another is the question that Bill pointed out, where the courts are always telling us what a word means. That's really what courts are for. What does it mean to protect the environment? Is it trees? Or is it me? My pleasure in living in my house, is that protecting the environment? My quality of life, or the quality of life collectively in my community, and is that different? The question of other tools that we use or can use, aside from CEQA, that might be less convoluted, that might be better suited, but on the other hand, might not be necessarily easy to impose statewide. We talk about better planning. It's a good thing to talk about, but the question is, if you're up there like our very special guest, the recently elected new state senator, Hannah Beth Jackson. For those of you who don't know her, she's not ours. But we don't have Fran Pavley anymore either. We have Ted Lieu. But Hannah Beth is in Ventura and Santa Barbara.
This deputy, Jennifer.
Deputy from Ted Lieu's office is here. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome. So in our discussion, I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, to do 2 things for me. One is raise your hand. Don't exhibit your barely repressed Tourette's syndrome and just like talk to me. And I will call on you, and in an hour, believe me, we have enough time for everybody to say what they want to say. But the other thing is, Even though I gave the panelists 15 minutes each, I really would like to only give you each 1 minute. You don't need to make a speech. Many times, I think we know kind of what's going on here, but we expect a robust discussion between you and the panel. So let's start with you.
Gail, you were mentioning the possibility of more overall planning. Would this possibly be taken care of by more, I'm not a CEQA expert, but what I hear the word programmatic EIRs, and then specifically with regard to planning, you're talking about increasing the density and accepting greater traffic density. I guess I would throw it back and say, why not say, if we're going to plan for greater density, why not impose a traffic mitigation fee on developers? I mean, I come from right down next to San Pedro. There's development down there, Honey Vista, that's been thrown all over the place for years, and the biggest issue that neighbors care about is because on one of the two routes out, and if they're committed to people to greater frequency for buses, perhaps, I don't know.
Well, in order to impose the fee, you have to have a plan that identifies what your priorities are, what the projects are, and then you establish the fee. So that is exactly what I'm suggesting. There are communities all over California that have facilities financing plans because they have, with their community plans, they create a chapter on what are the public facilities that are needed to support that plan, including traffic improvements, and they actually charge a fee. But you need to do the plan, and a lot of cities like LA doesn't have that kind of a plan. I don't know if Santa Monica has that kind of a plan or not. I'm suggesting, though, that that we require it in the same way that we have required other things. And as long as you include with that requirement the ability to create that fee to pay for the requirement, you're okay. The big problem with planning is, CEQA gets paid for by the developer. And so we'll do CEQA all day long. We'll make them this thick. What do we care? But we have no general fund money to do planning. So we've got to figure out how to get money from the development community to do actual planning. And there are ways. We just haven't, gone that direction.
Bill or Mike?
Just a quick, first of all, that's a good question. To my mind, the trick here is this. First, I agree that planning could be the answer to broader questions than those that are analyzed and evaluated and permitted through the CEQA process. My concern is those planning documents, whether they're a general plan or a community plan or whatever, specific plan, any of the planning tools, also has to analyze, as would CEQA, the projects within that orbit, within that universe of that plan, in a way that is CEQA equivalent. Otherwise, what you're doing is we're saying a plan can result in a proposed outcome that we would have to permit simply because it's in the plan, regardless of the broader environmental impact questions that would be analyzed under CEQA. So, in SB 375, a couple of years ago, more like 4 or 5 years ago, we took baby steps down this path by telling local governments that if they did a plan, a sustainable community strategy, we called it, that met certain criteria that was important to the state, then they wouldn't have to reanalyze or reevaluate those provisions again in a subsequent project. So that's a little bit of what I think Gail is talking about, that would give some meaning, some legal meaning, not just a planning document, but legal meaning to those kinds of plans. The flip side, however, is this. And both of my co-panelists here have raised this problem, which is the budgets for planning are gone. Planning departments are literally closing. And a lot of plans are so out of date and so behind that we wouldn't certify those plans as being acceptable to base land use decisions on for things like climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, because they just didn't even talk about them, right? So before we go much further, I think we're going to have to do what they said, which is if we're going to use plans as the basis for project approvals, or at least avoiding the need to reanalyze and reevaluate certain questions, we're going to have to do a lot more on planning. And I'm open to that. I mean, CEQA already contemplates through what's called the tiering process, using a larger document as the basis as a springboard for a series or for one or more smaller projects that don't have to reanalyze those environmental impacts. So I think there's a way to work through this, although the funding in this climate is going to be very difficult.
Let me take the next one.
Oh, can I just add a comment?
Yes.
I just wanted to add, I think many developers would happily pay a fee to respond to something like the traffic impact of a project or other negative consequences of a project if they thought that it was a fair fee, and if it's something that is predictable in advance, that is not something that's going to be made up on the spot, and something they can actually budget for, and if the thing which the fee pays for is something which relates to the actual project. I think part of the problem is that in some local governments, there's been a proliferation of talk about different kinds of fees, so that, say, in one part of the city, it could be that traffic is a problem, is the #1 priority. It could be in another part of the city, there's a desire for money to pay for childcare for the workers who live inside. Somewhere else, there may be a priority on paying a living wage to the people who work in the project that's going to be built. And so does it make sense to have different kinds of requirements? But I think most responsible developers, and even some irresponsible developers, would happily pay a fee if it brought certainty to the process, especially if paying a fee sped up the process for getting a project approved.
As loud as you can so they can hear you in the back too.
One reason why I think it's a terrible idea to say CEQA should be limited just to analyzing programmatic plans and not projects under plans is, as a practitioner, and I think there's other practitioners here, I have yet to see a plan that is being followed. Local governments don't follow their plans. If you raise issues that have to do with density, with view protection, or thresholds in plans, often the answer is we're going to get sued by the other side, or it's going to be a taking. In fact, Senator Kuehl, you have a wonderful example. You wrote a letter in a case, and this goes to another issue. Sometimes a project must be denied. Sometimes that's the best alternative. It's not just how to make it better. Sometimes making it better is not making it. And the example I wanted to allude to was I was at a celebration of the opening of the King Gillette Ranch National Recreation Area Center. That was a CEQA battle that was won and did away with a horrendous project in the San Monica Mountains. But it was not provided for that project in the plan. Most of the projects come with plan amendments these days. So the plans aren't being followed anymore. And the second problem that's very closely related to that is that courts, they defer to what local governments say the plans are. I mean, I can give you examples where in Thousand Oaks, a plan would say this area is hillside undevelopable, and they just ignore it. And the courts say, well, they say undevelopable means developable, and they go for it. I just had South Tower cases in the San Gabriel Valley where it says you can't have them in public parks in the ordinance. unless they are effectively unnoticeable in certain other areas. And then planners come and say, well, they're effectively unnoticeable because there's already light poles, as though someone could not see a fake pine tree, or tell a fake pine tree from a light post, or a light pole, or a cell tower that has a radome that's bulging at 36 inches on top of it. People aren't that stupid, but the problem is courts and planners get into the courts, they go behind what planners say or local government officials, whatever the political majority is, what the plan is, and so you can't enforce the plans. If the plans were enforceable, as was the case in the 70s when they were considered really having the force of law, we'd be in a different ballgame, but that's not the case. One quick comment about the unions. What is wrong with a union enforcing a statute? CEQA. If I'm in Bakersfield or in Tulare County and a lot of citizens don't have the money to pay for an attorney, well, thank God there is a union that protects the air quality, and there's cases that stand for that.
Normally I would say, I know there's a question in here somewhere, but let me take what you said as a sort of a question without a question mark. If there's a response, because everything raises a lot of good issues. Gail.
Yeah, I would not disagree that a prevalent problem in Los Angeles, and I can't speak for Santa Monica, is that the plans aren't followed. The plans are so out of date. They don't reflect even, I think the general plan priorities. And so I think that one of the things that we talked about, and Mike was on the planning commission, was this idea of real planning and what is a real plan. And for me, it's a plan that you conclude with a lot of community participation so that there is strong in the community. Communities protect plans, but they have to believe in their own plans. And there is no attachment in LA, in the community, their community plans. I mean, they wouldn't love everything that's in their plan. They wouldn't try to protect plans. So we better plans.
And I attended the Michael Rubio's presentation at the LA Chamber of Commerce recently, it was a couple weeks ago. And one of the things that troubled me the most was the sort of direct attack on public participation and the public's right to bring litigation. And to me, that is at the crux of CEQA. If we can't have a tool which requires response, which requires public input, and we won't have a tool that will force change. And I think that that's what all of us, as members of the public, as members of environmental groups, want to be able to bring the best change possible for our community. CEQA is the way we do that. And if you eliminate the public participation, the public requirements for response, the overall cumulative look, and I'll tell you, plans do not work. We did a circulation plan, we put the roads right through vernal pools. It would never have come out until they did the environmental impact report. So you need that tiering. You need it. But that was the whole crux. Get rid of public participation, get rid of the right to sue. And I looked at who was in the audience. It was New Holland and Farming pushing it. It was these really big developers. And I just hope that you as planners will recognize the importance of our ability to promote change. We won't have that if these parts of CEQA are eliminated. And I just am feeling really desperate about this. I mean, in our community, we have a huge pollution plume. They weren't counting the water as available. It wasn't until we brought suit and wanted the appellate court that they forced them to disclose that in urban water management plans and in water supply assessments. And thank you, Sheila, for requiring that.
Yeah, thank Bill for that.
Well, right, Bill knows me.
I just like to say as a planner, I agree with absolutely everything you said, and I would not support anything that diminished the public's ability to participate. That, to me, is one of the most important things about CEQA. And so I wouldn't disagree with anything you said. I think what you talked about is exactly what CEQA is for.
And when I asked him at the end of
I'm sorry, I don't know who you're talking about.
Michael Rubio, Senator Rubio.
Okay.
When I asked Senator Rubio, why was this push? What we need is a study to see how much impact there really is. He said, oh yes, public planning studying, who are they? You know,
For PPIC.
right, PPIC has done a study and it shows that there's only 2% of these cases that are ever litigated. But it's the 2% that are the big developers like New Holland and Farming, 80% owned by New York hedge funds that are bringing this enormous amount of money and pressure into trying to get rid of public process and the public's right to litigate. And I hope you'll protect that. I hope you will all protect that, because if we lose that, we're going to all be in big trouble.
I've been there since 2008, but I think it's very unlikely that there would be an amendment passed by both houses and signed by the governor that would do away with, or even cut back on, public participation in this process. I think it's highly unlikely. Rubio is a Central Valley guy. He's not with us on many environmental things. The fact that he's been appointed to chair the Environmental Equality Committee is troubling to me, but I'm not the pro tem, and therefore I get to talk to him in private, you know. So.
I have a two-part question that I think may go to some of the root problems here. One, you mentioned the overriding considerations, which I think is at the heart of one of the problems of why we do use it for everything, why we do use CEQA for everything, because you can have a project that's going to be built in a high-risk liquefaction zone with very high explosive factors, largest Native American burial site, and that did happen right here in LA. And they'll have overriding considerations, so it doesn't matter. Overriding considerations means none of the impacts matter. And one, I know that wasn't part of the law originally, and maybe Bill, you could, or someone could speak to why that was put, well, I know why it was put in, easier to approve, but how could, I'd like us to get back to not having overriding considerations anymore. Maybe then the decision makers could realize they have the right to say no occasionally for these big impacts, and then maybe something like things that really are what we consider the environment, like if it's a wetland, we've destroyed most of our wetlands, or there's endangered species and we have hardly any left. Maybe those things, you know, you can't pass overriding considerations. Maybe for certain things you could have overriding considerations, but not for things that we know are so at risk and imperiled that we don't have much. And then the other thing relates to money, and you mentioned that, Mike. I think that the reason why so many decision makers on the local level approve these is their budgets are all tied to more development. Someone said to me once in one of the planning departments that it's kind of like an addiction. If we don't approve more development, we don't have more fire stations, and we don't have more roads, and somehow we have to keep paying for those things, and the only way we do it is approving more development. So there's no limit ever thought of in any communities. So I don't know if you could talk to either of those issues.
Marcia, on the money front, you know, that's true. What you say is true. We have tried. We have given money through a couple of bond sources to regional and local planning efforts. It's a drop in the bucket, you know. But it's all, at the time it was all we had, and we don't have that left now. Although we'll see what happens now in the next cycle. Overriding considerations is a tough one. Technically, this is where what the words on the page say and how it's interpreted at local levels differs a lot. Technically, the statement, I mean, the use of overriding, well, let me back up. Overriding considerations is a method by which a local government or a lead agency can say, we've looked at this project, we really want this project. Actually, they shouldn't say that. It shouldn't be. It should be, we've looked at this project. There are environmental impacts that are not feasible to mitigate. Feasible means, feasible is a key word here, meaning it's not practical or not economic to mitigate. And so, therefore, based on substantial evidence in the record, these are all loaded words, we're going to approve the project anyway. Now, but the way I described it's a lot different than the way Marcia described it. The way Marcia described it is the way it's used in practice, which is, we want this project and we're going to approve it, and somebody said we can't mitigate that, so we agree with whoever that is, and this project's approved. That's the way it happens in practice, but that's not the way it's actually worded in the statute. But sometimes there's a breakdown there, in case you've never noticed.
That's why we have courts.
So, right. So, you know, I don't know if we can get rid of it.
If
You
they
know.
start pushing too hard on the other things, tell them there's a big pushback on that.
Okay.
That could be a negotiation.
I'd like to respond to the lady's comment about money and the influence of money. I think in general, I'll give you a general observation, which is I think most people who go into planning are not motivated to expedite projects because it will produce tax revenues to expand the city coffers. I think most planners don't think that way. If anything, I think planners sometimes draw criticism for being the ones who are responsible for adding requirements, making things take longer, making projects cost more if that's what's necessary to make a project better. In some local governments, there is a school of thought that approving projects is important for the tax base, and in extreme cases, I think in some local governments, there's a school of thought that planners ought to be charged with the responsibility of greenlighting projects in order to have this benefit on the city tax base. It could be that in Sacramento, when the changes in CEQA are being debated, that one of the underlying questions is going to be what's the relationship between environmental regulation and the state's economic prosperity or lack of it. This gets played out at local government as well as at the state level, but I think planners for the most part aren't really guilty of that, mostly. I think most planners are trying to do the best job they can to make projects as good as possible within the real world environment of not wanting to delay things unnecessarily and not wanting to add unnecessary costs.
I would absolutely second that. The political problems that I had and my planning department had were really around our unwillingness to blanketly approve projects. And so I would totally agree. I don't think that's how planners think.
It's the electeds.
Yeah,
It's the
and
elected councils.
So Ms. Goldberg, you were head of the planning commission from 2006 to 11, is that? Or
the planning
department? Oh, yeah. And anyway, there's one case I want to find out who was the ultimate decision maker. So the South Central Farm at 41st and Alameda got bulldozed on 6/13/06, and then I think it was in 2007 that a plan was, fortunately they have to leave it within 300 feet of the project, and so the South Central Farmers had a building, so they found out about this garment warehouse distribution center, which they tried to sneak through on a mitigated negative deck, even though their paperwork admitted it would have 2,581 additional diesel truck trips a day in the Alameda corridor, which is the most polluted area of the region other than the immediate harbor area. And so did you have any decision that, was it underlings, was it pressure from Jan Perry's office, or he made the decision that they should try to sneak it through on a mitigated negative deck, but then I commented 15 pages.
I'm almost
comment.
positive that no planner ever came to me and said, should I sneak through a mitigated negative deck? I can assure you that never, ever happened.
But they obviously, someone did it on their own apparently.
I'm not familiar with That project, I don't remember it, so I can't tell you. I don't have an answer for you. I honestly don't know.
So there's often, people see 15 fiefdoms in LA and everyone's supposed to determine land development in their area except for, unless you represent Playa Vista area. And so how often are the council members' offices applying pressure to have a steepier document?
I can tell you that when I became planning director, my commitment to the mayor was, I believe in public process, so I'm going to do that as much as I can. And I think he liked that. I came from that environment. I also told him I'm going to give you the most credible planning department that I can give you, and no one will tell us what to make, what our recommendations are going to be. And I was clear. I don't care what the council does on TV, and I don't care what you do, but I care what the planning department does. I care about credible recommendations. If planners ever told me, and this sometimes happened, that a council office called them to talk about a project, I told those planners to immediately tell any council office to call me. They were not to talk to council offices about projects. And I did get a few calls. I was very clear it's not what we do. And I can remember getting screamed at by a council member in my boss's office about a recommendation that the council member didn't like. And that council member, who shall remain nameless, said they would call the mayor immediately. And that council person did, and I waited in the office. The mayor called, and he was on speakerphone, and his remark was, "I understand she's immovable." And my boss said, "Yes," and he said, "Okay," and hung up. I mean, nobody ever told me I had to approve, and I'll tell you, I don't need the job that bad, and I would not be in a job where that was required.
Good for you.
Could you stand up so they can hear
Yes,
you in the
my
back?
name is Mike Burke, and the reason I'm here is I was working out at Mar Vista Park, and a young lady, she said, "Well, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm in environmental control, and I'm just consulting now and doing presentations on sustainability." She said, "You might want to go to this." I know nothing about politics. But Sheila, you said something, you said two things, and I'll take the first thing, then I have a basic question. You introduced Mike Blue, and you talked about his profession at Cal Poly, and one thing that you failed to mention was that Cal Poly generates more fantastic mechanical engineers than any university. And matter of fact, they're just prolific throughout this area and up in north. And mechanical engineering is one of their fortes. Do you agree with that, Mike? Absolutely. The other thing that you said was that CEQA was to take care of, I'm paraphrasing now, green pastures and protect the country, and then also protect the countryside. Also, you said, but it also is to increase my standard of living if I'm in my house.
Not standard of living, quality.
Quality of living, yes. Yeah, thank you. I never was correct. But anyway, I want to present this to everyone. But I'll ask this question first. When we say we're trying to protect the environment, and we're evaluating the environmental impact, there are more means to that than just extending the life of the plant. And I believe politically, and from the standpoint of public groups, that they're missing one thing. And you were the key to it when you said it. What we're really trying to do is protect people and their quality of life. And I have no axe to grind in this, but the state, the city, the county, and this goes throughout the United States, and we should take some real lessons from the Europeans. We have all the tools in the world. Mrs. Goldberg, very impressed with your articulation. It's fantastic. We can protect the people in buildings right now, and we're all remiss in doing it, and I have no answer. The air in the buildings, and this gentleman mentioned so many diesel trucks, we've got airplanes in Santa Monica, we've got the carcinogenic effect, the respirable particle effect, is so detrimental to people in occupied spaces, and it costs nothing to do it, and we're never bringing it up. And it's really, I won't say it's a sin, but for lack of my vocabulary, it's totally remiss. And Mike, I don't know what your engineering background is, but you know mechanical engineers, and they say, okay, ASHRAE says it, but we really need to attack that. Now, you take USC, they've done environmental impacts, and boy, they're tough on this, okay? But I really think the public groups should really take a good look at this, because people just east of Santa Monica Airport, even though the traffic's not heavy, they're getting carcinogenic diesel fumes in their buildings all the time, in their homes. And then you take anything downtown or in Riverside County, San Bernardino County, children, lung capacity is reduced by 20% by the time they're 18 because of the respirable particles in the carcinogenic fumes. And what are you doing about this? And we go under the guise of, oh, environmental impact, sustainability, maintain to sustain. We can protect people that are in occupied spaces 80% of the time. The car, the building, work, and home. And we're not doing it. So I wanted to say that. And by the way, that's it. No, I'll say one more thing. I have a real theme. I heard two things in here. Mike, it came from you a little bit. Political, and the other thing, budgets. In the real world is Americans have to do it with a cut budget. We've got to do more for less money. And the other thing is we've got to stop being political. And I'll guarantee you the public will respond to people that aren't political. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Exactly the question, but let me try to address what the gentleman was saying. When I was on the Planning Commission, an example of the kind of issue that you're talking about came to my mind when I was looking at the front page of the LA Times about 5 years ago. You may recall the front page article which reported on the health effects of breathing the air near freeways.
Yes, sir.
It was a study done by some researchers at the Keck School of Medicine, quite alarming about what researchers were finding about the effect of breathing the particulates that are especially heavy around freeways, which have a lot of truck traffic. And so I read the article and I thought, we get a lot of projects coming before the Planning Commission that are located within 500 yards of a freeway. How can we be doing that when, according to the study, it's especially bad for children, it's especially bad for old people, and for people in between who have respiratory diseases. So I think this probably caused heartburn for some of the staff, but I decided to bring it up at a Planning Commission meeting. How can we do this? How can we do this when there are these scientific studies out there? The problem was, well, what are you going to do about it? There wasn't the political will to talk about something like creating a buffer zone around the freeways. Some attorneys mentioned to me there could be a problem here in terms of what about projects within 500 yards of a freeway already approved by a city? Would the city be somehow liable for having approved those projects? And then, you know, like driving down Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, look at that big high school that's right by the on-ramp to the Hollywood freeway. Did LAUSD think about this when they put that new high school there? And so this problem, we had a hearing on it. We actually heard from the researchers at USC. I think it made commissioners and staff worried about what are we going to do. But it actually took several years before, I think it was earlier this year, the department staff came up with a recommendation not to create a buffer zone with no housing in it, but to establish some kind of notification process to people who live in new residential projects within 500 yards of a freeway about at least being aware of the possible health effects of breathing the air near there. So in that case, it took several years for something to happen. It's probably, I mean, I think I would have been willing to support some kind of buffer zone, but you know, politically the support wasn't there to do that. And so In that case, I think we're starting to make some progress, but it takes a long time to get the process to work.
Mike, you were next.
Yeah, so
No second thought, sorry.
Marcia's question raised a possible path in CEQA reform that I wanted to ask you all to consider, and that is, it seems like could be a connection between not having overriding considerations as much and having more plan-based CEQA, and that there could be a trade-off there. It seems like a natural, you would only give up the overriding if it fit more with the plan. I'm wondering if that might be something to comment on.
You know, I have to say, I love the enthusiasm behind that concept. Strengthening CEQA, that's what an idea. So I don't know. I honestly don't know. But I get your point, I get Marcia's point, we'll find out. I just want to go back to the last question very briefly to say, I think we all recognize that public health issues are linked clearly to environmental protections and the success of those environmental protection efforts. But CEQA itself is limited, sort of. I'm going to read you this definition here in a minute. CEQA is about the environment. It is not the California Environmental and Public Health Quality Act. It's the Environmental Quality Act. And the definition of environment, and this has come up a couple times this evening, what environment are we talking about protecting? Well, here it is. Environment means the physical conditions that exist within the area which will be affected by a proposed project, including land, air, water, minerals, flora, fauna, noise, or objects of historic or aesthetic significance. So, under especially the category of air, CEQA does protect air quality, toxics, against toxic emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, but it doesn't protect directly against all public health impacts from all proposed projects. It just doesn't. So I just wanted to...
I think it's important to note that more and more planners are thinking about healthy communities, and there's a whole range of things that come under that category. I mean, I think all of us know that a more walkable community where children and adults have access to outdoor areas and are walkable places are healthier. We're now thinking about food that is found in a community. Are there grocery stores? Are there healthy food? So more and more. The city of LA is, as we are speaking, writing a new element of the general plan that addresses health in the community, which, and I think they got money from the county, and you know, it's a matter of getting money, but they did a deal with the county, got money from county health, and are writing an element. For me, that's the first step. Let's get into our general plan policies that address the issues, that identify what we mean by health, and I think that air quality is certainly a part of that health and understanding those impacts. But I like to see that kind of comprehensive look, and I'm thrilled that the city of LA is at least starting that. I think it's going to be hell to pay when they get to city council, because by the way, city council didn't ask them to do this. And my own experience in LA is that when you decide on your own that they need to address a new policy and they haven't asked you to do that, they're not always thrilled to see you get there, you know, a few years later. So when they have to start addressing those kinds of thorny issues, including what it means to put development next to a freeway, and I think that will come up. I think it's going to be a very interesting public discussion.
Especially at 34th and Beacon, which it looks to me like they're building under the freeway, and how many of you want to live there? I don't know. Yes.
May I? Thank you. A two-part question, really. One is about prior legislation that has changed CEQA, SB 375, SB 226. These are very significant changes. why are they never enough? There's always more demands to roll back more. The second part of my question is there was a proposal, as I understood it, SB 317, to do some sort of standards-based CEQA change. Didn't seem like that was available, and why not? And can you really rely on standards like the Clean Air Act, which don't seem to have protected enough to, as a basis, roll back CEQA and protect even less? So complicated, but.
My answer to this question is probably oversimplistic. It seems to me that the call for CEQA reform is sort of inversely correlated with economic cycles. In other words, when the economy's in the tubes, CEQA reform becomes the call that we see a lot of. You know, I have to say your question about previous CEQA amendments reflects my view. We have, this isn't the first time there have been calls for CEQA reform. And ever since CEQA has been passed, it's been amended. I mean, a number of amendments to CEQA has been enormous. Just in the last 3 years, we did an exemption. These are, I'm not proud of these, I'm just telling you what they are. We did the exemption for the City of Industries football stadium. We did the NFL deal for the City of Los Angeles, which is not nearly as gross as the City of Industry bill. 226 amended SB 375 and expanded further the infill exemption for transit priority projects. You know, it's endless. The number of bills and the number of times we amend CEQA is really pretty astonishing. I don't think the public is aware of how many times that law has been amended. And I'm sorry, I forgot the third part of your question.
It was about 317, and people, yeah.
317 is, yeah, I alluded to that earlier. That bill would basically eliminate the cumulative impacts analysis for projects. It would eliminate, and it would substitute the idea that if you comply with various standards, general plan, Clean Air Act, whatever, then you're done. You don't need to do a CEQA analysis of the impacts. My personal view is that would gut CEQA.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to know that there will never be an end to proposals to undermine CEQA, to change CEQA, to lessen CEQA, and to do away with CEQA. One of the answers that people have sought is just an exemption for a particular project. Just, this doesn't have to comply with CEQA at all, we're going to build a football stadium. And easier to get away, because legislators are not voting to do away with CEQA. They're not voting to amend CEQA. They're simply saying, okay, just for this one thing, don't have to go for CEQA. But then, of course, you have a spate of 1,400 bills saying, wait, what about my project? Let's exempt that from CEQA. And then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Let us exempt all highway construction from CEQA, because highway construction is so important, so that more cars can ride on the highway. So, you know, it's like an open door. I know that you've probably seen complaints about the rules about complying with access for people with disabilities, that there's been a lot of litigation. When somebody comes into your shop and they can't get to the bathroom, they sue you. And people have complained, and their answer is, do away with these requirements, because they're leading to a lot of litigation. And yet, they're not. Or fix them. But then, of course, fix is how far do you change a thing? And thinking in terms of public policy, I think this is part of what we're thinking about tonight, which is the question that this gentleman sort of raised for us. What is an environment? What is an environmental impact? How much does it relate to human beings? How much to a breathable planet, or whatever? And then the question of how far will the legislature be willing to go to change it? Let me ask, I know there are a number of students in the audience, and we haven't really had a question, or maybe we haven't, I don't know, because We do have a range of ages in students here, but is there a question from a student? Yes, please, as loud as you can, please.
Okay, well, this might be a stupid question, because you all seem very smart. I'm just wondering, why are we building so many freeways and not investing in actually public transportation and metro subways? I've seen that lines in Venice and Santa Monica, train lines that are not used. And I mean, my professor mentioned that's because they want to sell cars to the west side, whatever. But why not do that nowadays?
Well, it was a tire company and a gas company that bought up all the streetcars in LA, upon which I rode as a little girl. But the answer, why there are so many freeways and...
I think that because there are still a lot of citizens who believe that if you increase the capacity of a freeway, that you are going to create less traffic. Not understanding that whatever capacity is created on a freeway will be immediately filled. But people don't understand that. And so people, there are lots of folks, I mean, when we went for the transportation bill and Measure R, I mean, the whole public discussion, what we really need is transit. But there are a lot of communities that would not vote for a tax that only went to transit. They want to create more capacity to make those freeways move faster. And the reality is that whatever capacity we create, we will fill. It's as simple as that. And, you know, one of the things that I like to remind audiences when we talk about growth, I've heard a lot of folks here, or a few folks talk about, you know, when is it enough? I mean, you know, okay, we should just stop. The reality is that stopping development does not stop growth. People come to your community because they have a right to come to it, and they come to it because there are economic opportunities for them, and they come. And you can either accommodate that growth by planning for it and planning for the facilities, or they will come and you will have an overcrowded situation and people underhoused and people crowded together and no ability to pay for the infrastructure to support them. I believe we have a public responsibility to accommodate the growth that we know we're going to get and to do it in the most responsible way possible. And in the future, it has to be in a way that will bring less cars than they've brought in the past. Because when California gets another 1 million people, and they will, I don't know when, but they will. If that 1 million people bring cars at the same rate that they have brought them in the past, it will bring 660-something thousand new cars. And even if you could figure out how to put them on your freeways and streets, if you accommodate their parking at the current rate of 4 or 5 parking spaces for every car, home, work, around the city, that's about 37 square miles of parking. That's almost the size of San Francisco. I mean, really, it just doesn't work. So we have to accommodate growth in a more responsible way that's less car dependent.
Plus, we never hit our climate
Yeah.
I want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Richard Tavaldran, because I mentioned him before, but I can only take one more question, and the gentleman in the third row has actually had his hand up.
Can I just say that Ty, the young woman who asked the
Yes,
question,
yes.
is incredibly bright and smart. She has lots of solutions for our community, and she almost single-handedly led the effort at Santa Monica College to register young people to vote, which contributed to the passage of Proposition 30.
Let's see. All right, I'm
Pam.
going to take 2 more questions.
Pam.
One from you and one from Pam, and then we'll close, okay? Please.
We were talking about changing ADA and fixing ADA, what's a fix, and how do we deal with pressures to build out versus infill and dealing with re-tenanting a lot of these buildings that are vacant. My family owns a building where it's an old building built in 1952, and the frustrations of ADA and plumbing and where a bathroom is and where the lines are, and working with the City of LA and the Building and Safety Department, deal with ADA compliance of the building is a real concern for people that are trying to re-tenant places like Melrose, that have a lot of vacant shops on it, that are not leading to tax revenue, and the city, getting the city to help people re-tenant buildings is a real problem. So when we talk about jobs, when we talk about tax dollars, we should figure out how to get the city that we do have working so that we don't have these pressures to keep building out, but we use what we already have.
Thank you, very good. Pam, last question or comment?
A comment and question. So this year, Southern California Association of Governments, the 6th County Regional Council, adopted the Sustainable Community Strategy and Regional Transportation Plan for the region. And part of that is the growth forecast, which comes out of SB 375 too. It says there are going to be 4 million more people coming to our region. So, and that is, they're coming to our region because it's birth over deaths, most of it. It's not people migrating in, it's our children who are being born. Now, to your comment about the city of LA, they're going to be surprised, the council there, not the ones who don't participate in SCAG, because there was a real folks from the public health community, active living, pedestrian and bicycle advocates, who are saying we do need more of this kind of mobility in our region. And right now, by the way, the Air Quality Management District is working on the AQMP, their plan. And I do want to point out that Metro's 2,000 buses are clean fuel, Santa Monica's buses are clean fuel, and every rail line you get is electrified, so Expo is electrified. But this is now leading to the question. So in the past, when traffic analyses have been done and level of service is up, the mitigations have been to, okay, let's widen the street. Let's make the traffic improvements so that car with a single occupant can get through. And then that ends up creating places that are harder for a pedestrian to walk through, that are harder for a bus or transit to get through. So how do we get over that obstacle?
Well, that was sort of my first solution with let's do mobility planning and create priorities in communities that reflect our desires, including those communities where we've decided we're not going to widen the streets, we're not going to, it's going to be level S, that's okay. Let's figure out how to have a better pedestrian environment, let's figure out how to get bikes, let's invest in transit. And one could do that if one had a mobility plan that included a fee for all new development to contribute money to make those improvements, just like we did schools.
And I would add, we also need to re-educate engineers. Although that's starting to happen, and I think younger engineers are more broad-minded than some of the older engineers in terms of thinking about streets differently, not just as conduits for cars, but also as ways for people to move around, whether in a car or a bus or on a bicycle. But there are some basic attitudes which are contained in pseudo-scientific formulas used by engineers to determine how wide streets should be, or to determine the number of parking spaces that should be required going along with new development. So I think that as new engineers arise, and as new ways of educating engineers arise, and as others in the community have more of a say in what our streets and our communities will be like, that the layout of streets and the degree of pedestrian orientation will gradually change.
Go back to their sense of place.
Well, I had a great time. Very much for being here. We'll have our next program after the holidays in January. You have only one more job tonight, and that is